Now for this video on my favorite jazz musician, I would love to sort of play you some music of his in the background, but because we are where we are, that's not gonna happen. Instead, I will not put any music in the background of this video at all, and I encourage you to sort of go on YouTube, maybe Spotify, type in Louis Armstrong, and just put on the playlist or put on the greatest hits album or whatever, and then you will have the background score. Strike this content ID. Louis Daniel Armstrong was not born on the 4th of July 1900. This should not be unusual, as most days throughout history are days on which Louis Armstrong wasn't born, but it turns out this is actually important because there is disagreement on the matter. Paper records indicate that he was actually born on the 4th of August 1901, but he claimed that his birthday was on the 4th of July all his life and always celebrated his birthday on that day. His mother also claimed that he was born on the 4th of July, and, let's just say that New Orleans is not and never has been very good or very well known for being good at accurately keeping records of pretty much anything. A lot of people just celebrate both birthdays. I disagree with this. I think we should also celebrate the time between the two birthdays. And I'm not talking the 4th of July to the 4th of August. I'm talking the 4th of August to the 4th of July. And then maybe also we can the other month in between, because, why not make it a full year? Also, it is very much Louis, not Louis. It's a Louisiana thing. You wouldn't understand. I know I don't. Mary Albert, Louis's mum, was only 16 when she had him, and his dad was a, shall we say, a bit of a champeray, a bit of a scamadook, a bit of a Papin Rollins, a bit of a Mac tracker. None of those words actually exist, I'm just improvising. But he was a massive dick. He abandoned his son and then also his daughter, who was born to the same mother 2 years later. Louis was raised mainly by his grandmother and grew up dirt poor and lived in Storyville, which at the time was a really down and dirty red light district from the late 19th to the early 20th century, in a Amsterdam-style attempt to regulate, but not really regulate, prostitution. It was eventually shut down when America joined World War I, so soldiers stationed in New Orleans would not be distracted by Punani. It's also one of the birthplaces of jazz music and led to an interesting early desegregation as black and white musicians performed side by side. It was here that Louis discovered very early on his passion and love for music, and also came into contact with Joe King Oliver, who would become one of his greatest musical influences. Being dirt poor, Louis worked for the Karnofskis, who were a family of Lithuanian Jews who also treated him like family. They ended up helping him buy his first cornet, and he wore a Star of David around his neck all his life to commemorate everything they'd done for him. As a kid, he would sing on the streets for tips, and whenever someone threw him money, he would store it in his mouth so the other kids couldn't take it from him. This earned him the nickname Satchel Mouth, which eventually was just shortened to Satchmo. Oftentimes, he wouldn't just introduce himself to people as Louis Armstrong, but as Satchmo. But let's be honest, the origin story for that nickname is probably just that, a story. Satchmo was fond of those. On New Year's Eve 1912, when he was 11 years old, he fired a gun into the air and was arrested for that, and then sent to a boys' home run by a former US Army captain. I also was sent to a boys' home when I was 11, but we had mattresses, and we ate meat, and we were allowed to talk during meals. None of which can be said about the boys' home that Louis Armstrong was sent to. The boys' home did, however, have a band, and through hard work and dedication and a lot of talent, Louis actually got into that band and eventually became its leader, under the musical tutelage of trumpetist Peter Davis. After 2 years of being in the boys' home, he was sent back to his dad, who was still a dick, and had built a family of his own in the meantime, and he just did not feel welcome there. So he opted instead to move back in with his mother, despite the fact that she was dirt poor. To earn money, he started to work as a musician all over New Orleans, but primarily in Storyville. In 1918, he began to play in a riverboat band led by Fate Marable, who aspired to excellence. He was classically trained in the musical arts and imparted much of his knowledge to the band, and thereby Louis Armstrong. He developed his skill set as a truly professional musician here, becoming known for his big-time trumpet solos, which were unusual at the time. He also performed off the boat quite a bit, of course, and on one particular performance night in 1919, he met a prostitute named Daisy Parker, who he fell in love with. They got married that same year and actually adopted his first cousin once removed, a 3-year-old child named Clarence, who was developmentally disabled and whose mother had died. However, in 1922 he moved to Chicago to join Joe King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. Having earned some money on the riverboat, this was a whole new way of life for Lewis. The band was huge, and he was able to get his very own apartment for the first time in his life. He soon became widely known and respected as an up-and-comer in the scene. During this time, having separated from his first wife in 1923, he also met his second wife, Lillian Hardin, herself a jazz pianist, who helped him develop the business side of things, often clashing with his creative desires. But he only stayed in Chicago for like 2 years before he was offered a spot in the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra, which was like the cream of the crop when it came to black musicians in the whole country. I'm just assuming that you're all aware that at this point in time there were old black people who had actually been slaves at an earlier point in their life, and segregation was all the rage in the United States. Though he was half a country away from New Orleans, he never forgot his roots. When he was in Chicago, he used to write letters to people to just tell them what's going on, old friends. And while he was in New York, he liked to put in some Big Easy spice into the performances that he gave, which people enjoyed tremendously. He was such a creative force of nature that you could actually listen to a sort of progression in the change of how the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra played during the really quite short period of time that he was with them. He returned to Chicago in 1925 to form his very own band, the Louis Armstrong Hot Five. And this wasn't just the time when he was continuing to develop his skills as a musician, he also really developed skills as a foodie. Let me tell you, Louis Armstrong loved his food. Strutting with some barbecue, a cornet chop suey, cheesecake, the Potato Head Blues. Go through a Louis Armstrong playlist and it feels like half the songs are just about food. His very favorite dish was red beans and rice, which was sort of like a childhood throwback thing for him. And he loved this dish so much that he would often sign letters with "Red beans and ricely yours, Louis Armstrong." The Hot Five were prone to experimentation, playing their jazz music in various contexts where it maybe wasn't as well known before, and adopting new styles into their own brand new style of jazz. Many people credit Armstrong with the introduction of scat singing to jazz, which is very much not what you think it is. It is just you make mouth noises that are ultimately nonsensical, but they jive well with the music. Louis Armstrong was a master of scat singing. And I will not regale you with an impression, because my Louis Armstrong impression sounds like I am bursting a blood vessel in my anus. The Hot Five quickly rose to the hot shit. Everybody in the country loved them. They influenced countless young musicians, black and white, with their jazz revolution. They were in fact so popular that in 1927 they became the Hot Seven. Being a household name, Louis soon began performing in the Sunset Cafe, at the time one of the most important jazz clubs in the country, owned by Joe Glaser, a member of the Capone criminal organization. It was notable for not being segregated and thus encouraging exchange between musicians and audience members from different races, producing a number of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. As a vocalist, Armstrong was known for taking already popular songs and making them his own, changing them around a bit and applying his own unique musical style to them. This was not considered plagiarism, which it also shouldn't be considered plagiarism today, and it mostly isn't considered plagiarism today by musicians. It's only considered plagiarism by, record companies. It's more like a remix. And this is one of my favorite things about Louis Armstrong. When you hear his voice, just when he talks, you'd think that is not a singing voice, that you cannot use that voice for singing. And then he starts to sing, and you go, holy shit, I was very wrong. When he moved back to New York in 1929, his associations with organized crime continued, mostly because the entertainment industry at the time was essentially controlled by mobsters. His main stage was in Harlem in a club called Connie's Inn, a jazz club founded by 3 Latvian bootleggers and acting as a money laundering operation for members of Lucky Luciano's New York Mafia Commission. But the Great Depression hit, and it hit hard, and people just didn't have the money anymore to go to jazz clubs and pay money to musicians. So Louis Armstrong was forced to go to Los Angeles, where there were still rich people to whom jazz was a novelty. While the jazz scene in the rest of the country sort of deteriorated, not artistically, but financially, economically, he was actually able to make quite a bit of money in Los Angeles, and he made it into a couple movies even. In 1931, he was forced to go back to Chicago because in Los Angeles, he had been caught smoking marijuana in a parking lot because, oh yes, Satchmo loved that reefer. He even made a song about it called Muggles, which at the time was a very popular euphemism. Marijuana had actually just become illegal, and he was the first high-profile celebrity case to be prosecuted for this, to sort of make an example of anyone who thought, oh, I can still smoke weed. These whole prohibition things, they don't count for nothing. Which, considering that his sentence was suspended, doesn't really speak of the effectiveness of the statement that was made, but it is California. Back in Chicago, he recorded his very first super mega hit, When It's Sleepy Time Down South. But he didn't stay long, because you see, the problem is, he had left all the business side of the whole thing to his wife, and he had no idea that the New York and Chicago mafia organizations were feuding over the rights to him. Because he was so massively successful, and because of just weird backroom dealings and agreements and legal binding things that maybe you put a signature under one that also contradicted the other, both were under the impression that they held his contract. Probably also, if they hadn't had the documents to back that up, both of them, they would have also been under that impression because they're criminals. Both New York and Chicago wanted him as a permanent fixture in their jazz clubs and threatened him over it. Louis's marriage broke down over this. One day, when a guy with a gun was waiting in his dressing room telling him that he would board a train to New York tomorrow to become essentially the property of mobster Dutch Schultz, he instead took an earlier train down to New Orleans. Back home, everybody loved him. He hung out with old friends, he visited the boys' home where he grew up, and he even funded a baseball team. But he had to keep moving, so he started touring the United States, always one step ahead of the mob. You might imagine that this is not a very sustainable lifestyle for someone who is as happy-go-lucky as Louis Armstrong, always having gangsters breathing down your neck. So he went to the only place where he would be safe: Europe. Though not as much of a household name in the old world as he was back home, radio had carried his tunes over, and he toured the whole continent. He performed in Oslo, Paris, Amsterdam, but probably his most notable performance must have been in Buckingham Palace in 1932. King George V was apparently very fond of jazz music, and Armstrong was just one of many famous jazz musicians invited to the palace. Right before he and the band started playing You Rascal You, the lyrics of which go, "I'll be glad when you're dead, you rascal you," he looked up at the king and said, "This one's for you, Rex." And you know what? The king did die 4 years later, so I'm not saying Louis Armstrong had magical powers or anything, but the causal link is pretty clear. No, but seriously, King George actually gifted Satchmo like a high-end trumpet after the performance, so he must have taken it with humor. Many people genuinely don't know this, but Buckingham Palace is actually a bit of a jazz museum. Apparently the royal family is super into jazz. Eventually, Louis returned to his home country, where he discovered that you can't just run away from your problems. Though he worked a lot and he made a lot of money, his many contracts and the sinkholes where money would slip through, and also the fact that he had grown quite accustomed to a lavish lifestyle, made it so he made money, but also just immediately it was gone. He had debts, he had big-time troubles, most of which were with the mafia. He hired Joe Glaser as his manager. If you remember, he's the guy who owned the Sunset Cafe, and he actually, after quite some time, did manage to sort out the troubles. But that didn't get rid of all his problems, because you see, it's very common for trumpet players to get lip problems, lip injuries, and Louis Armstrong was just particularly aggressive in his style of playing, so much so that it not only destroyed his lips, but also his fingers. So instead, he focused on singing, appeared in a couple more movies, and eventually became, on CBS, the very first African-American host of a national program. Radio program, that is. There was no TV yet. Over the coming years, he toured all over the world. He had a third wife that few people actually know much about, and then he married his fourth and final wife, Lucille Wilson. In 1943, they bought a house in Queens, which, considering he liked luxury, was neither super big nor super luxurious. It was very stylish though, and did feature quite a few amenities that you would not have found in the average household, such as a custom stove in the kitchen and a speaker in the bathroom. Now, why was there a speaker in the bathroom? Well, obviously, so Louis Armstrong could listen to music while taking a shit. Let me tell you one thing about Louis Armstrong. He loved a good shit. Shitting was a hobby of his. He used a Swiss Chris, which is apparently like a brand of herbal laxatives, which people back in the day unironically used to lose weight, and it sort of worked for him. He loved this particular brand because it made his shitting sound like applause, is how he describes it. Like, that is actually a true Louis Armstrong fact that is true. He gave these packets to everyone he taught, even the British royal family. He gave packets of Swiss Chris to. He was never paid for this, by the way. He just genuinely believed in Swiss Chris as a product. He didn't sit on the pot all the time, though. He performed about 300 times a year, which is a lot of times. Eventually, he was able to return from the big band model to the small band model that he had enjoyed when he was younger in New Orleans, because it was just not getting... People didn't like big bands anymore, and, you wanted some more personal, up-close jazz. And so he formed the All-Stars. Louis Armstrong was beloved internationally, but he was especially beloved in the United States. So much so that despite being a black man, he was accepted by white high society not just on stage, but also in private, which is insane. He was probably the first and only black person at a time who, despite segregation, was respected and accepted in that way. In a time of really high racial tensions, his music transcended race, and in private, he did help advance a lot of black people. But in public, his stance on segregation was mostly one of silence. A new generation of highly educated black musicians emerged, and they were none too fond of Louis. To them, his style was debasing to him as a black man. He was barely more than a minstrel, like an Uncle Tom who just all he wanted to do was to please and entertain the white man. And despite his incredible skills, Louis Armstrong wasn't very educated on and didn't really take much of an interest in the more academic side of music and music theory. He was such a massive celebrity, such a just objectively powerful person in the cultural zeitgeist of the time, that a lot of black people felt very irritated about the fact that he didn't use his platform to advance the civil rights movement. He did, however, eventually take a very strong stand, and first in his hometown of New Orleans, of all places. In 1956, the state of Louisiana banned mixed-race musical groups, and Satchmo was having none of it. He refused to play anything in the state until the law was taken off the books in 1965. In 1957, with the Little Rock incident, he also spoke up. Following a Supreme Court ruling from 1954 declaring segregated schools unconstitutional, the NAACP began registering black students in white schools. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 students were enrolled in Little Rock Central High School 3 years later, but the governor called on the National Guard to block the black students from entering. Ultimately, President Eisenhower federalized the National Guard and gave orders for them not to block the black students going in, but to instead escort and protect them. This was by no means an immediate reaction. He didn't get the paper on the Resolute desk that said, ooh, fucking there's a problem with the state is not complying with the Supreme Court decision. No. People in the South had a very big problem with desegregation, and the White House opposing them could seriously hurt Eisenhower's reputation. It took several weeks for Eisenhower to issue the appropriate commands to the National Guard, and Louis Armstrong was one of the loudest voices in criticizing him for that. In 1964, he recorded his all-time biggest smash hit, Hello, Dolly, which took the #1 spot in the charts away from the Beatles, who had been topping the charts with I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, and Can't Buy Me Love for 14 consecutive weeks. Only his record was then up there for 22 consecutive weeks. He beat the Beatles. Okay, that's just not something that anyone could do. Despite his advancing age and numerous health complications, Lewis toured all over the world. In every single continent he performed. He saw almost every country in the world at that time, and he loved it. He even performed in the Soviet Union and would have gone on a big tour of the Soviet Union sponsored by the US State Department, but he decided against working for the government because he was very pissed at them that there was still segregation. He loved meeting new people, talking to them, exchanging experiences, seeing the sights and bringing his music to this new place. And also, of course, he really loved eating the food. But the one thing that Louis Armstrong loved the most was his music. There wasn't a day where he didn't enjoy being a musician. That is why he performed so much. He just loved making music. He loved creating new music. He loved talking to musicians, mentoring new musicians. At every stage of his life, Louis Armstrong was a huge creative influence on pretty much every musician around him. It was incredible. Contemporary jazz musicians, not just jazz musicians, but just musicians in general, future musicians. They were all, to some degree, even the ones who rejected him, influenced by his style. When he was 67 years old, he was diagnosed with heart and kidney disease, and he spent most of the next year resting. That must have been quite the change, right? I mean, you spend your whole life touring the world, performing at every step, and suddenly you have to just stay home for a year. In 1970, he actually had recuperated quite well, so like any normal person, he decided to take it slow, maybe, play a few concerts, see where it would lead. Just kidding, he immediately went on a world tour. Just the first thing he did was he jumped out of bed, he was healed, let's do a world tour. And then he had his second heart attack. His doctor said, Jesus Christ, Louis, would stop doing that. You're gonna kill yourself with all the hardcore performing and touring. So naturally, in 1971, he played for 2 weeks straight every single night at the Waldorf Astoria, at the end of which he had his third heart attack. And the moment he was released from the hospital, he began planning his next world tour. On the 6th of July, 1971, a month before his birthday, but also 2 days after his birthday, Louis Armstrong died of a heart attack in his New York home. Every musician of note, from Ella Fitzgerald to Frank Sinatra, attended his funeral. It was a sad fucking day. Louis Armstrong, the real king of jazz, Ambassador Satch, Pop, was dead. Hopefully he is trumpeting up in heaven, whichever one that is. When asked on the subject of religion, he liked to answer that, well, my dudes, I was raised a Baptist, I wear a Star of David, and I'm good friends with the Pope. Which is actually true. He did perform for the Pope. He actually met 2 popes, and he performed in the Vatican. That is also something that happened. There's been a small number of truly earth-shatteringly great, incredibly influential musicians over the course of history. I'm talking like Mozart, Beethoven levels of amazing. I, for one, count Louis Armstrong among them. He was one of the greats. For me, the greatest of the greats. Of all the greats, I enjoy his music the most because I am really into jazz music. He was a larger-than-life figure during life, and he certainly is a larger-than-death figure in death. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Interesting Lives. I've wanted to do one on Louis Armstrong for a long time. He's like I really like the guy, as you might have noticed. Like, comment, subscribe, share this with your relevant communities, but please do not spam them. Maybe consider supporting me on Patreon, following me on Twitter, or buying some of my merchandise. In that spirit, go listen to some Louis Armstrong, listen to some jazz music, and if you're not into jazz music, well, yes, there is something wrong with you, but also do go enjoy some kind of music that you do enjoy, which probably is silence, because I don't know, if you don't like jazz, I'm just saying, you're a sociopath, definitely, and see you around, cunts.